Remote trails, quiet cabins, and wild forests often promise adventure, but they can also turn into arenas of chaos when nature strikes back. From a brutal midday massacre in Montana to a deadly bear viewing tour gone wrong in Alaska, these encounters reveal how quickly ordinary trips can spiral into life-and-death struggles. Each story tells a distinct moment where overconfidence, chance, or sheer bad luck collided with an unstoppable force. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters where predators turned peaceful outings into scenes of horror. The Bob Marshall Wilderness in northwestern Montana had always been considered one of America's most pristine and dangerous backcountry areas. Established in 1964, this massive 1.5 million acre wilderness complex stretched across the Continental Divide, harboring one of the largest grizzly bear populations in the lower 48 states. The area's rugged terrain, dense forests, and abundant wildlife made it a perfect natural laboratory for graduate-level ecological research. Still, it also meant that humans were perpetual visitors in a realm where apex predators ruled without question. On August 14, 2001, 7 graduate students from a Montana University's environmental science program established their research camp in a seemingly peaceful meadow roughly 12 miles from the nearest trailhead. The team consisted of David Clark, a 25-year-old from Portland studying watershed ecology, Hannah Mills, 24, whose specialty was plant biology, Peter Reynolds, 26, focusing on wildlife behavior patterns, Laura Chen, a 22-year-old soil chemistry researcher, Michael Sanders, 27, who studied forest regeneration, Rachel Lee, 23, working on her thesis about alpine ecosystem interactions, and their supervising professor, Dr. William Hart, a 44-year-old veteran researcher with over 2 decades of wilderness experience. The group had been collecting water samples from various streams and documenting the health of riparian ecosystems for 3 days without incident. Dr. Hart had specifically chosen this location because historical data suggested minimal bear activity during late summer months, when the animals typically foraged at higher elevations. Their camp followed all recommended protocols. Food was stored in bear-proof containers hung 15 feet high and 6 feet from tree trunks. Cooking areas were positioned well away from sleeping quarters, and each team member carried bear spray and noise-making devices. The morning of August 14th began like any other research day. The team split into pairs to collect samples from different tributaries that feed into the main creek bisecting their meadow. David and Laura worked upstream documenting water chemistry, while Hannah and Rachel cataloged plant species along the creek banks. Michael and Peter set up monitoring equipment downstream, and Dr. Hart remained at the base camp organizing data and preparing lunch. Around noon, as the sun reached its peak and temperatures climbed into the 70s, the scattered team members had begun returning to camp for their midday meal. David and Laura arrived first, comparing notes on mineral content variations they had discovered. Hannah and Rachel were visible across the meadow, making their way back through the tall grass with their collection bags in hand. Michael and Peter were still downstream but within shouting distance of camp. Dr. Hart later reported that the attack began without warning. He was crouched over his laptop, entering data, when he heard what sounded like a freight train crashing through the forest behind him. A massive male grizzly bear, estimated at over 600 pounds, burst from the tree line at full charge. The animal showed no signs of the typical defensive posturing that preceded most bear encounters. Instead, it displayed the focused, predatory behavior that experts would later describe as extremely rare but absolutely terrifying. The bear struck David first. The young researcher had no time to reach for his bear spray before 600 pounds of muscle and fury slammed into him, sending him flying 15 feet across the clearing. Laura screamed and tried to run toward the tree line, but the grizzly pivoted with shocking speed and caught her within 3 strides. Its massive paw connected with her back, sending her sprawling face first into the rocky ground near the creek. Hannah and Rachel, who had been approaching camp from the opposite direction, heard the screaming and initially thought someone had fallen and been injured. When they saw the enormous bear standing over Laura's motionless form, both women instinctively ran for the nearest large trees. Hannah managed to climb about 8 feet up a lodgepole pine before the bear noticed her movement. The animal abandoned Laura and charged toward the tree, reaching up with its front paws and dragging Hannah back down by her legs. Her screams echoed across the valley as the bear shook her like a rag doll. Rachel had chosen a tree with lower branches and climbed higher, but her position provided her with a horrifying view of the carnage below. She watched helplessly as the grizzly released Hannah and turned its attention back to David, who was attempting to crawl away despite obvious serious injuries. The bear approached him methodically and delivered several more devastating blows with its massive paws. Michael and Peter heard the commotion from downstream and came running with their hiking poles extended like spears. Both men later admitted they had no coherent plan beyond trying to distract the bear from their injured colleagues. Peter reached the clearing first and began shouting and jabbing at the animal's hindquarters with his aluminum pole. The grizzly spun around with remarkable speed and struck Peter across the chest, breaking several ribs and puncturing his lung. Michael arrived moments later and managed to land several solid hits on the bear's shoulders before receiving a blow that shattered his left arm and opened deep gashes across his torso. Throughout the attack, Dr. Hart had been fumbling with his emergency equipment. His hands shook as he loaded a marine flare into its launcher, knowing he had only one chance to drive the bear away before it killed everyone in the camp. The flare struck the grizzly in the side and exploded in a shower of red sparks and acrid smoke. The bear roared in pain and confusion, momentarily backing away from Michael's prostrate form. Dr. Hart fired a second flare, this one landing near the bear's feet and creating a wall of sparks and smoke. The animal finally showed signs of retreat, backing toward the tree line while keeping its eyes fixed on the humans. It paused at the forest edge, as if considering whether to return for another assault before finally disappearing into the dense vegetation. The professor immediately activated his satellite emergency beacon and began triaging the wounded. David was unconscious with severe head trauma and massive lacerations across his back and shoulders. Laura showed signs of spinal injury and was drifting in and out of consciousness. Hannah had suffered deep puncture wounds to her legs and torso, while Peter was struggling to breathe through his punctured lung. Michael remained conscious but was losing blood rapidly from his arm wounds. Rachel climbed down from her tree and helped Dr. Hart apply pressure bandages and administer what first aid they could with their limited supplies. The next 6 hours became a desperate struggle to keep 5 critically injured people alive until rescue helicopters could reach their remote location. The Montana Search and Rescue Team, working in conjunction with Life Flight helicopters, successfully evacuated all 7 team members by late afternoon. David died during transport to the trauma center in Missoula. Laura succumbed to her injuries 3 days later despite emergency surgery. Hannah also passed away from her injuries several days after the incident. Peter, Michael, Rachel, and Dr. Hart survived, though all required extensive medical treatment and months of physical therapy. The attack sent shockwaves through the wilderness research community. Bear experts struggled to explain the animal's behavior, as the attack showed none of the typical patterns of defensive aggression or food protection. The bear had appeared to target humans specifically and deliberately, displaying what could only be described as predatory behavior in broad daylight. Wildlife officials tracked and destroyed the bear 2 weeks later, finding it in an emaciated condition that suggested it may have been suffering from disease or injury that triggered its unusually aggressive behavior. The incident served as a sobering reminder that even experienced researchers who follow proper safety protocols can become victims when wild predators abandon their normal behavioral patterns. The Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee had long been celebrated as America's most visited national park, attracting over 11 million visitors annually to its misty peaks and ancient forests. The region's dense hardwood canopy provided perfect habitat for the largest population of black bears in the southeastern United States, with an estimated 1,500 bears roaming the park's 800 square miles. Despite decades of educational campaigns about proper food storage and bear safety, the animals had become increasingly bold around campsites, leading to a concerning rise in human-bear encounters. On June 18, 2023, the Reynolds family decided to escape their hectic suburban lives in Nashville for a weekend camping trip in the mountains. Paul Reynolds, a 41-year-old insurance adjuster, had been planning this adventure for months as a way to reconnect with his wife, Amanda, 39, and their children, Ethan, 12, and Lily, 9. The family had limited camping experience, but Paul felt confident that a developed campground would provide adequate safety and amenities for their first wilderness adventure. They had secured a spot at a popular campground located in a valley surrounded by towering ridges covered in oak, maple, and hickory trees. The area was renowned for its scenic beauty and relatively easy access to hiking trails, making it an ideal destination for families with young children. However, the campground's proximity to prime black bear habitat and its history of food conditioning incidents made it a potential hotspot for dangerous encounters. The Reynolds family spent their first day hiking moderate trails and exploring nearby waterfalls. Paul had read about proper bear safety protocols online and believed he was following all recommended guidelines. However, in a moment of fatigue after setting up their tent, he made a critical error that would have devastating consequences. Instead of securing their cooler in the provided bear-proof storage locker, he left it beside their tent while the family prepared dinner. The cooler contained typical camping fare: sandwich supplies, snacks, sodas, and leftover fried chicken from their drive up from Nashville. The combination of meat and processed foods created an irresistible scent trail that drifted through the forest as evening temperatures cooled and air currents shifted. Around midnight, while the family slept peacefully in their tent, a medium-sized black bear weighing approximately 250 pounds caught the scent and began investigating the campsite. The animal had previous experience with human food sources and showed no fear as it approached the tent area. The bear started methodically tearing into the cooler, creating loud crunching and ripping sounds as it accessed the food inside. Paul was the first to wake. Initially confused by the strange noises outside their tent, he whispered to Amanda that he thought raccoons were getting into their supplies and decided to investigate. Without grabbing a flashlight or checking the situation more carefully, Paul unzipped the tent door and stepped outside in his pajamas. The black bear was less than 10 feet away, its massive head buried deep in the demolished cooler. When Paul's movement caught its attention, the animal looked up with food still hanging from its mouth. For several seconds, man and bear stared at each other in the darkness. Paul later reported that he felt frozen with terror, unable to move or speak as the bear's eyes reflected the dim starlight. The bear dropped the food and took several steps toward Paul, who instinctively backed toward the tent. This movement triggered the animal's defensive response, and it suddenly charged forward on all fours. The bear's front paws struck Paul in the chest, knocking him backward onto the ground with tremendous force. Its claws raked across his shoulder and upper arm as he tried to roll away from the attack. Amanda woke to her husband's screams and immediately pulled Ethan and Lily behind their sleeping bags while peering through the tent's mesh window. She watched in horror as the bear stood over Paul, who was trying desperately to crawl away despite his injuries. The animal appeared confused by Paul's resistance and continued to swipe at him with its massive paws. Paul managed to grab a battery-powered lantern that had fallen from their picnic table during the initial attack. With his uninjured arm, he swung the lantern wildly at the bear's face, activating its bright LED beam. The sudden burst of light startled the animal, causing it to rear back on its hind legs. In desperation, Paul continued swinging the lantern while yelling at the top of his lungs. The combination of bright light, loud noise, and Paul's aggressive movements finally convinced the bear that this food source was too dangerous to pursue. The animal dropped back to all fours and retreated toward the forest, pausing only briefly to look back before disappearing into the darkness. Amanda immediately called 911 while applying pressure to Paul's wounds with towels from their camping supplies. Park rangers and emergency medical personnel arrived within 40 minutes, finding Paul conscious but severely injured. His shoulder required emergency surgery to repair damaged muscles and tendons, while his arm wounds needed extensive stitches and antibiotics to prevent infection. The family's camping trip ended with a helicopter evacuation to a trauma center in Knoxville. Paul survived his injuries but required months of physical therapy to regain full use of his arm. Both children struggled with nightmares and anxiety for months following the attack, requiring counseling to process the traumatic experience they had witnessed. The Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana represented some of the most challenging and remote wilderness terrain in North America. This rugged range, stretching along the Montana-Idaho border, contained vast expanses of roadless backcountry where grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves roamed freely across millions of acres of pristine habitat. The area's steep ridges, dense forests, and unpredictable weather patterns made it a magnet for extreme athletes seeking the ultimate test of endurance and survival skills. Luke Patterson, a 33-year-old ultra-marathon runner from Missoula, had built his reputation on conquering the most demanding mountain courses in the American West. Standing 6 feet tall with the lean, weathered build typical of elite endurance athletes, Luke had completed over 50 ultra-marathons, including grueling 100-mile races through Death Valley and the Colorado Rockies. His friends and training partners knew him as someone who thrived on pushing human limitations, often training alone in remote areas where most people feared to venture. On June 6, 2020, Luke planned what he called a conditioning run through a network of primitive trails that wound through prime grizzly habitat deep in the Bitterroot Range. The route he had mapped covered roughly 40 miles of single-track trail, with over 8,000 feet of elevation gain. a distance and difficulty level that would challenge even experienced hikers over multiple days. Luke intended to complete the entire circuit in under 8 hours, carrying minimal gear and relying on his extensive wilderness experience to navigate potential hazards. Luke departed his truck at a remote trailhead before sunrise, equipped with a GPS tracking device, an emergency beacon, a lightweight running pack, and basic survival supplies. He had informed his girlfriend, Sarah, about his planned route and expected return time, though he often ran longer than anticipated when conditions were favorable. The early morning temperature hovered around 40 degrees, with clear skies and light winds creating ideal conditions for high-altitude running. The first 20 miles of Luke's route followed well-maintained trails through dense coniferous forests and alpine meadows. His GPS tracker showed steady progress as he climbed toward a 200-foot ridge that would provide spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Luke had run portions of this area before and felt confident navigating the terrain, even though he was moving through some of the most concentrated grizzly habitat in the lower 48 states. Around mid-morning, as Luke crested the main ridge and began descending toward a remote drainage, his GPS tracking device recorded its final movement. The signal stopped abruptly in a heavily forested area roughly 25 miles from his starting point, at an elevation of approximately 6,400 feet. The location was surrounded by dense timber with thick understory vegetation, providing perfect cover for large predators. When Luke failed to return by evening, Sarah contacted local authorities and initiated search procedures. Mountain rescue teams began mobilizing at first light, using Luke's GPS coordinates to focus their efforts on the area where his signal had disappeared. The search zone encompassed extremely difficult terrain with limited helicopter landing sites and dangerous approach routes for ground teams. Search teams discovered Luke's remains late the following afternoon in a small clearing, roughly 100 yards from where his GPS had stopped transmitting. The scene told a clear and terrifying story of what had occurred during Luke's final moments. Deep claw marks gouged into the earth showed where a large grizzly bear had made initial contact with the runner. Luke's running shoes were found 15 feet apart, suggesting he had been lifted and thrown during the attack. Scattered pieces of Luke's lightweight running clothing were spread across the clearing, most of which showed tears consistent with those made by large claws and teeth. His GPS watch had been broken and thrown against a nearby tree, its face shattered and the band torn completely in half. Blood evidence and disturbed vegetation indicated that Luke had attempted to fight back, despite being severely outmatched by his attacker. Wildlife experts who examined the scene concluded that Luke had likely startled a grizzly bear while running through the dense forest. Instead of stopping and backing away slowly, Luke's runner's instincts had probably caused him to continue moving or attempt to flee, triggering the bear's chase response. Grizzly bears could reach speeds of 35 miles per hour in short bursts, making escape impossible even for an elite endurance athlete. The bear had partially buried Luke's remains under forest debris, a behavior typical of grizzlies when claiming a food source for later consumption. This suggested the attack had transitioned from defensive to predatory behavior, one of the most dangerous scenarios possible in grizzly encounters. Search teams found no evidence that Luke had carried or deployed bear spray, a critical oversight that might have prevented the tragedy. Luke's death sent shockwaves through the ultra-running community, where he was known and respected for his achievements and safety-conscious approach to wilderness training. Fellow athletes struggled to understand how someone with Luke's experience and fitness level could fall victim to a wild animal attack. The tragedy highlighted the sobering reality that human athletic ability did not protect apex predators operating in their natural habitat. Wildlife officials spent weeks searching for the bear responsible for Luke's death, but never located the animal. The remote location and vast wilderness area made tracking extremely difficult, and officials eventually suspended the search. Luke's family requested that no further efforts be made to find and destroy the bear, arguing that the animal had simply been following its instincts in its own territory. The running community established a memorial fund in Luke's name to support wilderness safety education for endurance athletes. His death became a cautionary tale about the importance of carrying proper safety equipment and understanding wildlife behavior when training in remote areas where humans remained vulnerable prey. The Canadian Rockies near Banff have long attracted Hollywood filmmakers seeking dramatic peaks, pristine lakes, and expansive wilderness. This breathtaking beauty also harbors risks, with thriving populations of grizzly bears, black bears, and mountain lions. Crews working in such remote locations required strict safety protocols and wildlife expertise. Yet despite careful planning, The unpredictable nature of wildlife meant that danger could never be fully eliminated during filming in this rugged landscape. On July 10, 2024, an independent film company was shooting a low-budget survival thriller in a remote valley approximately 30 miles east of the main Banff town site. The production, titled Last Stand, featured a small cast and crew of 22 people working under challenging conditions to create an authentic wilderness drama. The remote location had been chosen specifically for its untouched appearance and lack of visible human development, factors that also made it a prime habitat for dangerous wildlife. Eric Turner, the film's 31-year-old lead actor, had extensive experience with outdoor adventure films, but limited knowledge of bear behavior and wilderness safety. The production's tight budget had resulted in minimal safety personnel and equipment, with most crew members focused on completing their shooting schedule before weather conditions deteriorated. The craft services area, where food and refreshments were prepared and stored, had been established in the center of the filming location without proper consideration for attracting wildlife. The morning's shoot involved Eric's character building a survival shelter using primitive techniques. Multiple takes were required as the director sought to capture the perfect combination of desperation and determination in Eric's performance. Between takes, crew members relaxed around the craft services table, which contained an assortment of prepared foods, snacks, and beverages that created a powerful scent trail detectable by wildlife from considerable distances. Around mid-afternoon, as the crew prepared for another take, a large brown bear emerged from the tree line approximately 50 yards from the filming location. The animal, estimated to weigh over 400 pounds, moved deliberately toward the human activity, exhibiting none of the typical wariness shown by most wild bears. Several crew members noticed the bear's approach and initially assumed it would investigate briefly before retreating into the forest. The bear's behavior quickly became concerning as it showed no signs of fear or retreat when confronted by the large group of humans. Instead, the animal continued advancing toward the craft services area, drawn by the concentrated food odors. Crew members began backing away and speaking in raised voices, hoping to convince the bear to leave without escalating the situation. Eric was positioned near a makeshift shelter constructed from logs and branches when the bear suddenly shifted direction and focused its attention on him. The animal's body language changed dramatically, with its head lowered and ears pinned back in an aggressive posture that experienced guides would have recognized as an immediate threat. Without warning, the bear broke into a full charge directly toward Eric's position. The attack happened with shocking speed and violence. The bear covered the 30-yard distance in less than 3 seconds, giving Eric no time to retreat or defend himself. The animal's massive front paw struck Eric in the forearm with tremendous force, instantly breaking both bones and opening deep lacerations from wrist to elbow. The impact launched Eric backward through the flimsy prop shelter, sending logs and branches flying in all directions. Eric crashed to the ground with the bear immediately on top of him, its jaws snapping inches from his face as he tried desperately to protect himself with his uninjured arm. The animal's hot breath and the sound of its teeth clicking together created a terrifying sensory experience that Eric would later describe as completely overwhelming his ability to think rationally. The film crew erupted into chaos as 20 people simultaneously screamed, ran, and searched for anything that might drive the bear away from their colleague. Camera operator Janet Mills grabbed a heavy lighting stand and hurled it at the bear's back, while sound technician Robert Chen began throwing rocks and shouting at the top of his lungs. Grip Mike Anderson dumped an entire cooler of ice and soft drinks over the bear's head, temporarily confusing the animal. The combined assault from multiple directions finally convinced the bear that it faced too many threats to continue its attack on Eric. The animal stepped back from its victim and began swinging its massive head from side to side, trying to track all the humans surrounding it. Several crew members continued pelting the bear with equipment, food containers, and anything else within reach, while others helped drag Eric away from the immediate danger zone. After what felt like an eternity, but lasted only minutes, the bear finally retreated toward the forest edge. The animal paused at the tree line and looked back at the chaotic scene before disappearing into the dense vegetation. The sudden silence that followed felt almost as shocking as the attack itself, broken only by Eric's labored breathing and whispered reassurances from the crew members administering first aid. Eric remained conscious throughout the ordeal but showed signs of severe shock and blood loss from his mangled arm. The production's first aid supplies proved inadequate for treating such serious injuries, forcing crew members to improvise pressure bandages from clothing and tape. The nearest medical facility was over an hour away by helicopter, assuming emergency services could locate their remote position. Production assistant Sarah Kim used a satellite phone to contact emergency services, while others worked to clear a helicopter landing zone in the narrow valley. The rescue operation required careful coordination due to the challenging terrain and potential for the bear to return to the area. Eric was evacuated to a trauma center in Calgary, where surgeons spent 6 hours repairing the extensive damage to his arm and hand. The film production was immediately shut down following the attack, with cast and crew members traumatized by witnessing the sudden transformation of their workplace into a life-threatening situation. Eric underwent multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy, but never regained full use of his injured arm. The incident prompted significant changes in safety protocols for wilderness film shoots. However, many independent productions continued to operate with minimal wildlife protection measures due to budget constraints. Lake Shoshone in northwestern Wyoming represented one of the region's premier fishing destinations, nestled in a remote valley surrounded by peaks exceeding 10,000 feet in elevation. The pristine alpine lake supported healthy populations of cutthroat trout. It attracted anglers willing to endure challenging access conditions for the opportunity to fish waters that saw fewer than 100 visitors annually. The area's isolation and abundant wildlife, including one of Wyoming's densest grizzly bear populations, made it both appealing and dangerous for overnight visitors. Brian Collins, a 39-year-old accountant from Denver, and his brother-in-law, Mark Ellison, 41, had planned their fishing trip to Lake Shoshone for over a year. Both men were experienced anglers with decades of wilderness fishing experience, though neither had significant knowledge of bear behavior or safety protocols. They had rented a small fishing cabin from a local outfitter, a rustic structure built in the 1970s that provided basic shelter but lacked modern amenities or wildlife-proof features. The cabin sat approximately 200 yards from the lake's eastern shore, surrounded by dense stands of lodgepole pine and whitebark pine that provided excellent cover for wildlife movement. Previous guests had reported occasional bear sightings around the property, but the outfitter had downplayed these encounters as routine and non-threatening. The cabin's construction included minimal security features, with thin walls, basic door and window hardware, and no reinforced barriers designed to withstand determined wildlife. Brian and Mark arrived at the cabin on October 12, 2023, after a challenging 4-mile hike from the nearest vehicle access point. They spent their first day exploring the lake and identifying productive fishing locations, catching several large cutthroat trout that exceeded their expectations. The successful fishing created an atmosphere of celebration and relaxation that led to poor decision-making regarding food storage and cleanup procedures. After filleting their catch that evening, the two men made a critical error that would have devastating consequences. Instead of properly disposing of fish remains or storing them in bear-proof containers, they placed a cooler containing fish scraps, leftover bait, and cleaned fish directly outside the cabin's front door. The concentrated fish odors created an irresistible attractant that bears could detect from miles away as evening air currents carried the scent throughout the valley. Around midnight, Brian and Mark were awakened by loud crashing sounds on the cabin's front porch. Both men initially assumed the noise was caused by raccoons or other small animals getting into their supplies. Brian grabbed a flashlight and peered through the front window, expecting to see minor damage that could be cleaned up in the morning. Instead, his flashlight beam illuminated an enormous grizzly bear methodically destroying their cooler and consuming the fish remains inside. The bear, estimated at over 500 pounds, showed no concern for the humans inside the cabin as it continued feeding on the fish scraps. Mark joined Brian at the window, and both men watched in fascination and growing terror as the massive animal tore apart their equipment with casual ease. When the bear finished consuming the fish, it began investigating other potential food sources around the cabin area. The situation escalated dramatically when Brian decided to scare the bear away by banging pots and pans together while shouting through the door. This aggressive noise-making had the opposite of its intended effect, triggering a defensive response from the grizzly that viewed the cabin as a threat to its newly claimed food source. The bear immediately focused its attention on the structure containing the humans and began testing the barriers that separated it from the perceived threats inside. The grizzly's first attack targeted the cabin's front door, which consisted of lightweight pine boards held together with basic hardware. The bear's initial swipe with its front paw splintered the door frame, creating a gap large enough for the animal to insert its massive head. Brian and Mark threw their combined weight against the door, while the bear pushed from the outside, creating a terrifying tug-of-war that the humans were clearly losing. When the door proved more resistant than expected, the bear shifted its attention to the cabin's windows. The animal reared up on its hind legs and smashed its front paws against the glass, shattering one window completely and allowing its massive paws to reach inside the cabin. Brian received several deep scratches on his arms and shoulders as he tried to push furniture against the broken window, while the bear's claws swept back and forth through the opening. For the next several hours, the cabin became a war zone as the bear methodically tested every possible entry point. The animal circled the structure repeatedly, pounding on walls, tearing at the roof edges, and maintaining constant pressure on the front door. Brian and Mark barricaded themselves in the cabin's back room, using furniture, mattresses, and anything else available to create barriers between themselves and the increasingly determined grizzly. The psychological terror of the extended siege proved almost as challenging as the physical danger. Every impact against the cabin walls sent vibrations through the entire structure, while the bear's huffing, growling, and claw-scraping sounds created a soundtrack of pure menace. Both men later reported feeling completely helpless as they realized their shelter was inadequate protection against a determined grizzly bear. The bear's assault continued until dawn, when the animal's behavior gradually shifted from aggressive to exploratory. As morning light filtered through the forest, the grizzly became less focused on gaining entry to the cabin and more interested in searching for additional food sources in the surrounding area. The bear eventually wandered away from the immediate cabin area, though both men could hear it moving through nearby vegetation for several more hours. Brian and Mark waited until mid-morning before cautiously emerging from their barricaded position. The cabin showed extensive damage from the night-long siege, with the front door hanging from twisted hinges, windows shattered, and claw marks gouging deep furrows in the wooden walls. Blood from Brian's injuries stained the floor and furniture, where he had received his wounds during the window attack. The two men abandoned their planned fishing trip and hiked out immediately, carrying only essential gear and leaving their damaged equipment behind. Park rangers who investigated the scene several days later found the cabin in ruins and confirmed that a large grizzly bear had been responsible for the destruction. The incident underscored the crucial importance of proper food storage and the limitations of basic shelter when managing food-conditioned bears in remote wilderness areas. Kodiak Island, 250 miles southwest of Anchorage in the Gulf of Alaska, is a premier destination for observing Kodiak brown bears. Spanning 3,500 square miles, it supports about 3,000 bears, the world's largest brown bear subspecies. Adult males often reach over 1,500 pounds during salmon season. Their size and predictable feeding at salmon streams attract wildlife photographers and nature enthusiasts who pay premium prices for unforgettable guided viewing experiences in the wilderness. On July 15, 2017, a small group of wildlife tourists had chartered a boat from the town of Kodiak to visit remote bear viewing locations on the island's rugged coastline. The group consisted of 8 visitors from the continental United States, including Patricia Long, a 54-year-old retired teacher from Phoenix, who had dreamed of photographing Kodiak bears for over a decade. Patricia had saved for years to afford the expensive guided tour, viewing it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to observe the world's largest predators in their pristine wilderness environment. The tour was led by David Ellis, a 47-year-old guide with over 15 years of experience leading bear viewing expeditions around Kodiak Island. David had built his reputation on providing safe, educational encounters with the massive bears while maintaining appropriate distances and following established safety protocols. His client groups typically observed bears from boats or elevated positions that provided natural barriers between humans and the potentially dangerous animals. The morning's viewing location was a remote bay where a salmon stream provided reliable bear activity during the summer months. David's boat approached the rocky shoreline carefully, scanning the area for bear activity before allowing passengers to disembark. Several large bears were visible feeding in the stream approximately 200 yards from the proposed landing site, creating perfect conditions for photography and observation from a safe distance. Patricia and her fellow tourists eagerly prepared their camera equipment as the boat maneuvered closer to shore. The group included both amateur photographers and serious wildlife enthusiasts, most of whom carried expensive telephoto lenses and professional camera bodies. Patricia had brought her most prized possession, a high-end camera system that represented months of careful budgeting and planning for this specific trip. As the tourists stepped onto the rocky beach, David emphasized the importance of staying together as a group and maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. Kodiak bears could move with surprising speed despite their massive size, and the island's dense vegetation provided numerous opportunities for unexpected encounters. David carried marine flares, bear spray, and noise-making devices designed to deter aggressive bears, though he emphasized that prevention through proper behavior was far more effective than reactive measures. The group had been photographing bears for approximately 30 minutes when Patricia noticed a particularly impressive male bear feeding alone near a fallen log. The animal's massive size and photogenic position prompted Patricia to position herself for better camera angles, gradually separating herself from the main group as she searched for unobstructed views. David was monitoring other tourists and did not immediately notice Patricia's movement away from the group's safe perimeter. Patricia set up her camera tripod on a small rise of driftwood logs that provided an elevated shooting position overlooking the bear feeding area. The location offered excellent photographic opportunities, but it also put her in a vulnerable position with limited escape routes. As she adjusted her camera settings and composed her shots, Patricia became completely absorbed in the technical aspects of wildlife photography, losing awareness of her surroundings and the potential dangers they contained. The massive Kodiak bear that had been feeding peacefully suddenly raised its head and fixed its attention on Patricia's position. The animal's behavior changed from relaxed feeding to alert investigation as it detected the human presence and began moving in her direction. Patricia continued photographing, unaware that she had become the subject of the bear's intense scrutiny, and that her elevated position on the driftwood logs was actually making her more visible and threatening to the approaching predator. When Patricia finally noticed the bear's approach, the animal was less than 50 yards away and closing the distance rapidly. Her instinctive reaction was to climb higher on the unstable driftwood pile, hoping to gain elevation and distance from the bear. However, her sudden movement and the loud snapping sound of shifting logs triggered an immediate charge response from the massive predator. The Kodiak bear covered the remaining distance in seconds, its tremendous bulk moving with shocking speed across the rocky terrain. Patricia lost her footing on the treacherous driftwood and fell backward as the bear reached her position. The animal's massive front paw struck her across the torso with devastating force, instantly breaking multiple ribs and causing severe internal injuries. David Ellis heard Patricia's screams and immediately began running toward her position while deploying noise-making devices and preparing bear deterrent equipment. The other tourists scattered in panic, some running toward the boat while others froze in terror as they witnessed the attack unfolding. David reached the scene within moments but found the massive bear standing over Patricia's motionless form, showing no intention of retreating despite his aggressive noise-making efforts. The guide fired multiple marine flares in the bear's direction while shouting commands and waving his arms in an attempt to drive the animal away from its victim. Several flares struck the bear directly, causing minor burns and confusion, but the animal's size and determination made it largely indifferent to these deterrent measures. Other tourists joined the rescue effort by throwing rocks and equipment at the bear, while maintaining what they hoped was a safe distance. After several minutes of sustained harassment from multiple humans, the bear finally began to show signs of retreat. The animal grabbed Patricia's body and started dragging her toward nearby brush, behavior typical of bears claiming a food source for later consumption. This predatory behavior indicated that the encounter had evolved beyond a defensive attack into something far more dangerous and difficult to interrupt. David and several male tourists continued their aggressive harassment of the bear, throwing larger rocks and pieces of driftwood while creating as much noise as possible. The combined pressure from multiple directions eventually convinced the bear to abandon its victim and retreat into the dense vegetation surrounding the beach area. The sudden silence that followed felt almost as shocking as the attack itself. Patricia was found unconscious and critically injured, with massive trauma to her torso, neck, and extremities from the bear's claws and teeth. Despite immediate first aid efforts and emergency evacuation by helicopter, she succumbed to her injuries before reaching medical facilities. The attack sent shockwaves through Alaska's wildlife tourism industry, prompting significant changes in safety protocols for bear viewing operations throughout the state.